Hello everyone, my name's GM Josh Friedel, and I'm doing a lecture on submitted games. If you'd like to have your games analyzed and critiqued and yelled about in this lecture, you should email them to, what's the address? info@stlouischessclub.com and then .org, sorry, and you can do it and submit it through the YouTube channel. Today, last week what I did was I went over sort of segments of games. I didn't go over complete games. I went over certain parts of different member games and said in this situation I would do this. Today I wanted to switch it up a little bit and actually go over a whole game which was submitted by a member named John Moorman. The reason I chose this game, first of all, is that he annotated it himself a little bit, and he also had some funny comments, usually self-deprecating, which I always can relate to myself. So I thought that it would be kind of nice to go over this whole game, and I'm going to kind of give you a Grandmaster perspective on problems that a club player will face during a game. So to give you a situational thing, this was played at a local club. I do not know the time control, but apparently there was no time control. I should read before I talk. And just a casual game. John was black and apparently was outrated by 500 points. So facing an uphill battle already with the black pieces against a higher rated foe. But let's kind of look at the game through John's perspective and see if we can come up with improvements on his play, see what he did well, see what he didn't do well, and hopefully we can kind of learn from these mistakes and it can maybe help in your own games. E4, C5, big blunder already, John, just kidding. Bishop C4. So you guys probably know that most people in this situation, there are lots of different lines. You could play C3 Sicilian. You could play grand pre-attack with either f4 or knight c3, f4. You can play closed Sicilian type positions with g3, bishop g2, or open Sicilian, which would go knight f3, for example, d6, one of many options. There's a check as well, the Rosolimo. And you get open Sicilian and tons of different variations. I'm sure most of you guys know this already. But how do you deal with a move like bishop c4? Let's say, you may have seen this move before. Of course, it can't be a terrible move, right? It's attacking the center, getting a piece out. I mean, how bad can it possibly be? So the question I have kind of for you guys is, how would you respond to a move like this? Like, what do you feel about it? And kind of how do you handle a situation where, say, you're out of book already on move 2, or out of book early, or at least not in familiar territory super early in the game? Yes? Very well said. E6 is a nice looking move here, which blunts the diagonal of the bishop and also prepares for d5. So I like this kind of thing a lot. And again, I would say one of the most important things is that often when people, especially club players I find, face moves they're not familiar with, they make the assumption that they're bad. I think this is a big mistake, because if you assume that a move is bad and it's perfectly fine, you're going to try to punish it unjustly. And you'll find that often you're unsuccessful because, the move's just not that bad. Bishop c4 may not be a main move here. It can't be that bad. It's just impossible. So you have to realize that while this might not be the best move to fight for advantage, maybe, it's not a terrible move, and you shouldn't go crazy trying to punish it. So, but I like e6 just the same. In the game, d6 was played, which I think is a perfectly fine move. Nothing wrong with it. It doesn't blunt the bishop right away, but it connects the pawns in the center, prepares to get out the bishop in some positions, doesn't hang anything. And I prefer not to hang pieces most of the time. So far, so good. White played knight f3. And here, John mentions that h6 prevents knight g5, but that further delays development and would have avoided a non-existent threat anyway. And I have to say that I agree with John's assessment, that this move is unnecessary. As far as moves like h6 go, I would say that almost always you don't want to play these moves unless there's a direct threat. which John correctly points out. And you don't want to be scared of ghosts in the opening. You can end up playing moves like h6, and it's not necessarily some awful move, but if you play too many unnecessary moves, you'll find yourself a little bit behind in development or committed to moves which you maybe don't want to be committed towards. So you want to avoid moves like this unless they're absolutely necessary. And you can actually get yourself into more trouble than simply developing and playing normal moves by trying to be overly cautious. So I like John's move better of knight c6. You could have also played e6, John, if you were really concerned with knight g5, but again, I think it's nothing. Nevertheless, white plays the move knight g5. So, let's see what my extremely strong audience has to say about this move. Yep.
e6 or knight e5. Those are the only two moves I'd consider here.
e6 and knight e5 are the two moves you consider. You don't want to put your knight on the edge of the board, I assume. And you're definitely want to deal with this threat. What do you think of the move knight g5?
I think it's a waste of time.
You think it's a waste of time. Why is that?
Because it's getting away from where it wants to be on f3, and plus you can easily stop the threat.
Absolutely. Moves like this are almost always just not a good idea unless you have a concrete threat that can't be easily parried. In this case, you're attacking the f7 pawn. Good for you. But when black defends it, is your knight good on g5? I don't think so. So I think that moves like this are almost always a mistake. What John says is that even though this is my first time playing my opponent, he senses I'm a beginner and therefore tries to beat him with a move like knight g5. I think this is just a terrible approach because even if your opponent falls for it, so what? Okay, you won the game a little easier. If they were going to fall for this and you're a much stronger player, you'd probably beat him anyway. You know? But if they defend against this threat and they play good chess, then you can find yourself in a lost position against an opponent who you should be beating. So I would say that avoid moves like this if at all costs. Now, another question. You mentioned knight e5 and e6. I really prefer one of these moves over the other.
Yeah, I like knight e5 better.
Interesting. I actually prefer e6. I want to hear your logic of knight e5.
Well, it's a tempo move. Well, e6 is too, but he played d3 and he's doing something he wants to do.
Aha. So
Knight e5, he's not going to give away the bishop pair.
So, your point is that knight e5 is a tempo move hitting the bishop, which means that it should be preferred over e6, which, while a tempo move, you can play d3 and defend the knight. I actually don't like this logic, and let me tell you why. The way I would think about it is that e6 is a move I know I want to play, for sure. So e6 is not only a tempo move, but it's an improving move for me. I don't necessarily want my knight on e5. I think that the knight's actually very nice on c6, and if I go to e5, I give the option, say, of playing bishop e5 check, which is obviously a tempo move in response, and I'm not so sure my knight's good here. Maybe white will play f4 and kick it away. So I actually much prefer e6, and in fact, that's what John chooses. So I think this is the best move. However, clearly John had to be a little bit, pay attention a little bit more, not only to his opponent's ideas, but to his own. Because white played a very poor move here. So the question is, why is queen f3 such a poor move?
Does it drop the knight?
Yes, it does. So this is something that looks really basic, like how can you not take a hanging knight? Well, John, we've all been there before. What happens is you get so carried away with your opponent's idea, you forget that you have moves too, that you have ideas, hopes, and dreams of your own. And in this case, queen takes knight parries the threat of queen takes f7 and takes a knight. So it can't really be argued with. And again, you can only logic so much when it's basically piece hang that you don't do. But I bet you, if this were just some normal position, you would have taken this knight immediately. The reason why this wasn't played is because you were so fixated, perhaps, on this pawn being attacked. You forgot that you're also attacking the knight. So you have to keep track of not only your opponent's threat and what they're doing, but all of your tempo moves and possible captures. Because queen takes knight takes care of this threat very handily and obviously takes a free piece. But of course, there are moments like this in lots of games. Knight e5 would be maybe another move to consider, but after bishop b5 check, you're not going to win anything. So I much prefer taking the knight for free. I like free pieces. It's one of my character flaws. So knight f6 was played, which does prevent queen takes f7 mate, so it's certainly not the worst move on the board. But obviously, the free knight would have been very tasty. So white plays castles, which is given a question mark by John because the knight really has no nice retreat squares and would have to go to h3. I would say question mark's a little bit harsh, John. The reason why is because if you play queen e3, you're also wasting another move. So black might develop in castle, and it's just too much time. Like, white's already wasted enough time, to be perfectly honest. That being said, the fact that this knight could end up on h3 is a pretty sad thing. But I think white's already in trouble. Despite the fact you didn't take this piece, you still have an excellent position. Everything's centralized. I like every single one of these pieces and pawns. Whereas these pieces look kind of ridiculous now that f7 is not a weakness. So you played h6, knight to h3, bishop e7. Here you chose to continue development while white's pieces are out of the game. I think this is an excellent approach. White played d3, and you played knight d4, threatening several forks and forcing the queen back to d1 to defend the c2 square. Now, I'm curious what our audience, our esteemed audience, thinks of this move.
I would probably have castled first and then played knight d4 because he's going to have to use a tempo to stop it.
Aha.
His bishop doesn't really belong on e3.
I agree with all of what you said, except I would not play knight d4 even after castling. And this is my reasoning. So knight d4 hits the queen and forces it back. Threatening several forks, I think, is a little bit optimistic, John, I have to say. It's one fork, and then the queen easily goes back. Why I don't like this move is because when the queen goes back to d1, your knight is now not really that well placed. It hits this pawn, that's wonderful. But next move, white's going to play c3 on you. And maybe you could try b5 and try to go after this bishop, but honestly, I don't really like moves like this unless you have a concrete follow-up. Like, if you thought b5 and winning, trying to go after this bishop was really strong for you, I kind of understand. But to be honest, I like the queen better on d1 than on f3. The queen on f3 is vulnerable to knight e5 attacks. Sometimes knight d4 can be an attacking move. It just doesn't really want to be here. So forcing the queen back actually improves the queen, at least in my opinion, and does not improve your knight. And this is the kind of move I see from, I'd say, club players all the time. And I think that if you can get it out of your system, you're going to play much better chess overall. What this type of move is, it's basically you look for tempo moves, which you always should. And that tempo move, of course, being any capture, any check, any threat. These are the moves that come first. So knight e5, knight d4, all moves to consider. But if a tempo move doesn't lead anywhere, you have to be able to let it go. Just say, I don't really want to attack your queen. It doesn't do anything. Knight e5, incidentally, would make more sense just because it hits the bishop. But of course, there's bishop b5 check. So you don't actually get to take this bishop for a knight, which would be a nice trade, admittedly. So I would have just castled here. I would have castled, saved knight d4 for a rainy day. Maybe knight e5 comes next. Saving this bishop, by the way, is actually not so easy now. For example, if the bishop comes back, you can play knight d4 and take it if you're so inclined. To be honest, I'm not so thrilled about even taking this bishop because it looks like a bad piece to me. Biting on granite on e6. But let's say c3 is played. You have the option of knight e5 now and taking this bishop. And this position just looks extremely pleasant. Yes, these doubled pawns may not be that bad, but it looks like a pretty good position to me. So I would have preferred castles. But you played knight d4, not a horrible move by any means. But again, I have a feeling this can be a slight waste of time. So queen d1, and you castled. So you wrote, I felt like I had the upper hand around this time, given that white's knight on h3 is awful, and moved twice. And white lost 2 tempi moving the queen. Unfortunately for my opponent, I am a beginner. So I like your sense of humor, John. The only thing I would correct is that, first of all, this knight's moved 3 times. And while you claimed that white's lost tempi with the queen, if white plays c3 and you move back, you've lost tempi with your knight. So I'd say that you have to be objective as far as who's lost tempi and with which moves. So your knight move kind of costs you a little bit here. You could have tried b5 and going after the bishop to at least justify this move. But again, I don't think taking this bishop is some huge achievement, just because, again, it's biting on granite. It's not doing anything. But OK. Knight c3, dubious. I thought my knight was going to be kicked by his pawn. And you were, in fact, correct. c3 would have been a better move. You could try b5, but I think you lose a pawn after simply pawn takes knight and takes. Maybe you can take here, actually. But again, I don't see any real need to go for this. It looks a little bit weird to me. But yeah, then the knight would come back and you would have lost the tempo. Knight c3 doesn't really punish your knight d4 move, because now your knight looks a little bit more reasonable. Also, I'd mentioned that this bishop might lack retreat squares in some positions. So you played b5. And this move, I think, is fairly poor. The reason being very simple, that I think white can just capture this pawn. I don't really see a reason not to. You gave this line, rook b8, and stopped here. But really, I think if the bishop just moves back somewhere, you haven't really gained enough for your pawn. Your rook's on an open file, but my bishop can shut it down very easily. This pawn's not even a weakness. It's defended by the bishop and can't be attacked. So it seems like you just lost the pawn for no reason. So you have to be very careful about, making kind of unprepared, like making pawn thrusts when you're not prepared to defend these pawns. I'd much prefer to move like d5. So first of all, if the bishop moves back, you can always take it and extricate your knight if you want. You don't have to take this bishop, but you can. And taking this pawn would be ill-advised. Perhaps an audience member can tell me why. Or perhaps not. All right. Because you recapture. The bishop would have to move anyway, and now you can shatter white's kingside with a move like bishop takes h3, queen d7, queen takes here, and I think white's going to be crying rather soon. And certainly regretting this whole knight escapade in the opening. So white probably should not take, but nevertheless, I think a move like d5, hitting the bishop, putting it on a square, can be captured, is a very nice improving move for you. So I would have considered this move instead. You played b5. Your opponent, for whatever reason, didn't feel like taking a free pawn. It's always nice when this happens. You played a5, going after the bishop. I can't say I dislike this move. White plays a3. But I don't really care for a4. Can anyone in the audience, which has now grown by one person, perhaps tell me why? Or do you agree with John's move? Do you think that a4 is a good move? You don't agree with it. So why would you prefer not to play a4?
Because the bishop's just going to go to a2, and it's pretty much as active as it was on b3.
Exactly. So while it looks like these pawn moves are nice, they're not necessarily achieving that much. For example, if you play b4, and I go back here, I don't think you've achieved that much. b3, you're not defended enough times really to support this. If you take and I take, you haven't gained anything. And this bishop is actually a little bit safer on a2 than it was on b3. To be honest, because I like your position so much, for simplicity's sake, I probably would have just taken this bishop off the board. And now notice how, because of a3, white has to compromise their pawn structure a little bit more. Always a good thing. And again, you have plenty of choices, but I like the very simple e5. Now note how there's no bishop to activate, as happened in the game, which we'll get to. But this knight is now under attack, and how do you defend that guy? Probably you have to play queen f3. But this is a bit of an unfortunate move, because the queen might end up on a bad square. I would even consider attacking the queen and playing b4. Note how e2 is taken away, and how your rook's defended.
And he might just make his pawn structure even worse.
Exactly. So in a position like this, I think that you should be fairly happy. I guess there's knight d5 you have to contend with, so maybe there are some tactical reasons not to do that. But even if you end up giving up your bishop and just coming back, look at this pawn structure. It's just really terrible. Again, maybe you could do better than this. I didn't care for giving up the bishop, but I was just kind of giving an example of how a move like queen f3 can lead to trouble. And again, you could also play just a very simple move like bishop e6, which I like more, because now you hit this weak pawn, and do you really want to play queen back to d1? I highly doubt it. So I think that this is just a great position for you. So you kind of missed an opportunity, and again, notice how simple it is. You just take away a bishop, play e5, hitting the knight, taking away the f4 square, so the knight can't get back into the game. And it's just very simple, and you'd have an excellent position. As is, you played a4, which again isn't a blunder or anything like that, but now this bishop's a little better. And your next move I strongly dislike. I'm kidding. It's not this move. You play bishop b7, which I think is perfectly fine. Again, you could play e5, but I don't like it so much because now you've given new life to this bishop. This bishop, which basically was biting on granite, as mentioned, now is a lot more open. So yes, you might take this knight and ruin the pawn structure, but even if white plays a move like f4, this pawn structure ruin isn't that big of a deal if my queen can kind of get over here to defend my pawns. And also note how now this bishop is just a monster because there's no way to dull it with a pawn. So for example, if you try to play queen d7, I play f5, play knight d5, you could end up under big attack for nothing very quickly. So this is actually how you get into trouble from a good position. So I only recommend e5 if you're able to snag this bishop. You play bishop e7, which is a developing move. It cannot be bad. Bishop e3. And this is where, so you played rook c8. I don't know. I mean, I would probably play something a bit more direct, like just defending this pawn. Even a move like queen b6, for example. But rook c8, you give it a dubious. I don't think it's that bad. But probably wouldn't be my move. I'd probably play something like queen b6, as mentioned. Knight f4 was played, so white's trying to get the knight back into the game, understandably. And this is where you play e5, which you correctly label as a mistake because you've opened up the diagonal for the bishop. So this kind of mistake usually comes from not being positionally aware. So what I mean by that is because you're kind of looking for tempo moves, you're trying to support your knight. If you look at it from this particular perspective, e5 makes perfect sense. And we've all played moves like this for sure. But you have to look at the whole board. It's easy to forget about this bishop because right now it's doing nothing. But the second you forget about it and move your pawn, you've activated it and make it a strong piece. Not to mention weakening a key square, which now this knight can hop into. So really, with one move, you kind of destroy what your position's about. Notice how white doesn't really have any threats here. If you just play queen b6, I mean, what exactly is white going to do? Trying to be super aggro and take everything is just bound for failure. I can even take this knight if I want. But even if I just play like this, there's no way in a middle game position the rook and pawns are worth the two pieces. In a middle game, the two pieces almost always will slaughter the rook and pawns. Just something I know from experience. There are exceptions, but right now, all white has to do is activate the pieces, maybe target this pawn. Once this bishop gets open, white's going to be toasted. So really, there was no reason to panic or do anything crazy. Queen b6, and you still have a beautiful position. But you played e5. Whether it was out of panic or just forgetting about this bishop, I don't know. But I would say that this really costs you quite a bit. So knight d5 would have been a very simple move, but this is also kind of annoying. Again, easy to forget about moves like this. But once you open this, that's kind of what can happen. To be perfectly honest, though, I'm not so sure taking this bishop is some kind of huge achievement. Because if you take this bishop, would you say this is a good bishop?
No.
It's on the same color as all the pawns, right? This is definitely the better bishop. Whereas if you play knight d5, just to show you, you're in no way obligated to take this bishop. Your knight's just going to sit here, right? So for example, if you play knight takes, you just have a beautiful knight. Now, probably black should try to play bishop g5 to trade off the bishop, but even a move like f4 is possible. And again, I'd say that white's taking the upper hand because black will have a weakness here, and again, beautiful, beautiful bishop. And you do not want your opponent's pieces to be beautiful. I know that sounds like a real piece of wisdom there, but I would say it's generally true. So knight g6. c4, so here I think you maybe panicked a little bit, John. Again, panic is one of the leading causes of death in chess positions. The reason why is because if you miss something, there are two possible reactions that people do, and both are mistakes. One is they either they just brush it off immediately. They're like, all right, I missed something, time to just play on. The problem with this is that if you miss a move, and I'm sure knight g6 was missed, as most of us would miss it, there's a tendency to kind of go, oh, I missed a move. All right, let's just move on and keep playing chess. The problem is if you missed a move, you're not seeing the position clearly. You're not seeing what's going on in the whole position. And when you do that, you have to reset, kind of refocus and be like, all right, what's going on in this position now? My rook's attacked, so I don't want to allow knight takes rook. And the bishop's attacked, but that's not a big deal. There's no mate threats that I can see. Maybe I'm missing them, but I don't see them. So if you play just simply rook e8, white's probably going to have to take this bishop, and that's not such a big deal. So the key is to stop and refocus. The other problem that sometimes people have is the opposite reaction. They miss a move and they just freak out. They just go, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, time to go crazy. And this is obviously also not a very good thing to do. It sounds like I'm exaggerating, but some people have this reaction. And the key is to have neither, to respond in a calm way, but almost never do you want to blitz out your move immediately after missing something. And you also don't want to panic. And oftentimes when you panic, you find some move which is completely irrational. Like to me, c4 is not irrational because you're trying to shut down the bishop, but you're not seeing the position clearly if you miss that your rook's attacked, right? If you had played the calm rook e8, the game would continue, and again, nothing horrible's happened. Nope, there's no fire, nothing horrible, just you play on. But after c4, and you drop your rook, now you're simply down in exchange pretty much for nothing. This bishop's sort of shut down, but at the same time, it can probably get opened later, and you're simply down too much material. So after bishop takes knight, I don't even know if I would take this knight. I mean, pawn takes pawn looks fairly simple. But taking the knight also has its pluses. So takes, yeah, knight takes b5, you're just losing too many pawns. And again, this knight is a little bit vulnerable, so maybe this would be a hope. But I'm not so sure you can actually win it. Queen b6, yeah, taking on d4 is quite bad. So it takes on c4. d5 I don't know about, but I mean, even if you just take on e4, maybe you have a little counterplay. But ultimately, you're just down way too much. This pawn's a little loose. You're down in exchange. You've lost some pawns. It's just hard to recover from something like this. Your opponent decided not to relieve you of your b5 pawn, though. At the same time, it's still very difficult to do very much. You played queen b6, which is a logical move. And again, maybe they should have thought about taking your pawn in order to take the d4 pawn. So for example, here, queen takes d4. Again, probably you just don't have enough. But they played knight g3. And what I would say about positions like this is that, okay, objectively, you're probably losing because you're down in exchange. But when your opponent does not have open files, being down in exchange can be not such a bad thing. Because think about it, if the rooks are not on open files, why are they better than bishops and knights? Is there a good reason? I don't really think so. So what I would say is that, again, even though you're down material and maybe with best play you're still losing because you don't have tons of compensation, your life's not so bad. Your opponent didn't take all your pawns, which is always nice. And now your pawns are actually nice and expanded. So, you know, if you ever get some threats going, your far advanced pawns will really serve you well. So what I'd recommend is trying to activate your pieces, keep the pressure on, and most importantly, do not open files. The second files open for the rooks and they start trading and infiltrating, that's when their power really shows. If you can keep the position as closed as possible, you're going to have a great shot at saving this game. So you played g6, trying to keep an eye on this knight. I don't think this knight hop was anything to worry about too much, but it's an understandable move. Your opponent plays queen f3. So you mentioned d5 as a possible move. It's kind of interesting because although it shuts down your bishop, it also shuts down this bishop. But bishop g7 I don't think is anything terrible, although I would have strongly considered knight d7 if I were you, with the idea of coming into e5 perhaps and trying to target pawns. Okay, bishop g7 is playable. Queen e2, I'm with you that white's making aimless queen moves. I agree with you completely. But again, this is something that's very common. It's not easy to play with rooks when you have no files. And I'd say from a practical point of view, people play these positions so badly because they don't know what to do. And you end up moving back and forth. Yes, would a computer win this as white? Almost for sure. But for a human being, I don't think it's so easy. You mentioned that it takes a safe square from the knight away. Also true. I mean, I don't like putting the knight on g3 to begin with. But I think the bigger problem is just white's wasting time. I don't agree that this is a question mark worthy move, but it's certainly not the best. So you take on d3. So I'm sure you could answer this by now if you've been listening to me and not falling asleep. But why is this probably not a good move?
It opens up his bishop.
Opens up the bishop is one reason, but I think there's a more important reason.
It opens a file.
It opens a file. When you're fighting against rooks, keep those files closed. And this is true regardless of how the pieces work. If you have two pieces against a rook and two pawns, keep the files closed. If you're down in exchange, keep those files closed. If you have queen against two rooks, make it so that the rooks do not get to work together on a file. That is how you end up in trouble. So this move I really dislike. So the question is, what's better? You mentioned h5. And it gains a tempo because white has to avoid h4. h4 is a little bit risky sometimes, but I definitely think it's a possibility. Another reason I like this move, which you don't mention, is let's say white plays f4. What potential move do you have now? Aha. And maybe the knight lands on e3, and then you could be in good shape. Occasionally, you might even think about takes in rook c2. I know you opened the file, which is against my rules, but if you get knight e3, rook c2, you might be able to live with that. And you have lots of counterplay here. I like this move h5. It's not the only good move. You could probably come up with some other improvements, but I like this h5 move a lot. Again, largely because this knight g4 move hinders white trying to open things up and go after your king. So I really like this approach. But after takes, you're going to have a hard time because, again, you've created a file. So you're trying to open lines for the bishop pair. The problem is that white's bishop's also open. And you're going to have a hard time doing this once the rooks come to the center. So white captured. You took with the knight. So you're having hopes and dreams of knight f4, I'm assuming. And your opponent eliminated it. Now, this is kind of an interesting decision. What do you guys think of bishop takes knight as a move?
I don't like that move.
And why is that?
Because even when you're down in exchange, the bishop pair might actually be better than a rook and a knight, depending on the position.
I agree with you in principle. Because, yes, the bishop pair can still be strong. And, you know, having this bishop on a2 is certainly not a bad piece. However, there's another rule which I want you guys to remember, which is that you want to keep things as simple as possible when you're up material. Often what that means is that maybe you have a good piece, but your opponent, this knight, can be super dangerous. Imagine the knight comes to f4, right? That's going to be a nasty piece. So I actually don't hate this move. I'm not saying I'd play it for sure. The first move I would look at, to be perfectly honest, is just developing my rook. I'm a simple man with simple tastes. I want to trade off the rooks. If black moves the rook, we can call this move certainly not bad, I would hope. And if you try to play knight f4, first of all, now I take and your bishop has to go. And if you take now and try this, I have the very nasty queen e8 check. And you probably are not happy with how your life has turned out at this point. If king goes here, for example, the very simplest, in my opinion, is maybe to just take with the queen. Because now you're threatening the knight, as well as queen g8 mate. This would be hard to recover from. So, I like the move rook c1, and maybe take next move if you really feel so inclined. But I don't hate the move takes, and the reason why is because black has fewer pieces to threaten you with. This bishop can't really threaten you, right? It's hitting this pawn on d4 and just not doing much. This bishop can definitely threaten you. This knight can threaten you. Obviously, the queen has ideas. But when you eliminate pieces that can threaten you when you're up material, oftentimes the win becomes easier because you have to deal with fewer threats. It's as simple as that. So I don't actually hate this bishop takes d5 move. And for sure, white should be winning in a position like this. You play rook c5, and you mentioned trying to retain control of the c file. I understand this temptation, but there's a little bit of flawed logic here. And I'm wondering if someone in our audience can enlighten us.
White's got more heavy pieces than you.
Indeed. And this is, I'd say, the major problem with your idea, John. That when your opponent has an extra rook for whatever reason, whether it's 2 pieces for a rook, whether it's an exchange down, if your opponent has that extra rook, you can never take the file. Almost ever. The exception would be maybe if the bishop could land on h6, but there's no time for that. So queen e7 was played, which is a good move, but let's even say white surrenders the file. And this is just a common thing. I'm not saying these are the best moves in this position, but I'm just trying to illustrate a point. Now I simply play queen d2. How are you going to hold on to this file? You can't, because I can play rook c1. Now, do I necessarily need this file to win the game? Not really. But just to illustrate it, you can never, ever claim the file unless your bishop can control the square the rook can go to, or there's some extraordinary circumstance. But when you have 1 fewer rook than your opponent, hate to say it, the files are theirs. Nothing you can do about it. Unless you manage with your 2 bishops to control every square on a file. That's your only chance. Now, when you're dealing with a situation like this, where you're down an exchange, and you have a situation where you can either trade rooks or keep rooks on the board, regardless of whether you're down material or not, let's say you have 2 pawns for the exchange even. So it's not a question of, oh, you don't want to simplify in a lost position where you're down material. Do you want to trade rooks when you have 1 fewer exchange, or you have more minor pieces than your opponent? I heard a whispered no. Any particular reason? I'm just going to wait for 10 minutes. No, just kidding. The main reason is just that, and you're correct, you want to keep rooks on the board. And the main reason is that when you have minor pieces, they work very well in conjunction with rooks. So even if you have 2 pieces for the rook, keeping a rook on the board is almost always a good thing to do. Now, there are exceptions to all these rules. As I mentioned to my students in chess, when I tell you a rule, it's usually true between 60 and 80% of the time. Almost never is it true above 90. Now, do you want to give up your queen for a knight? This is an example where it's above 90. But most general rules in chess, there are exceptions. But I would say the rule where if you have more minor pieces than your opponent, or are down an exchange, or in a situation like this, because remember, if you're down an exchange, you have an extra minor piece. Something to look forward to, right? That's why being down an exchange is not nearly so bad as being down a whole piece. Because there you're just down a piece. You have nothing more than your opponent does. But when you have more minor pieces than your opponent, I'd say at least 80% of the time, you want to keep rooks on the board. The exception would be that if you're just getting checkmated somehow, or if you're simplifying into an easily won position. Obviously, there are exceptions. But for the most part, keep that rook on the board. I would play rook d8 here, even if it means somehow you get viciously checkmated. I don't see how it's going to happen. But I would say that keeping the rook on the board will give you more chances for counterplay and more chances for white to blunder. And it's not just because you're refusing to trade when you're down material. It's because the rook and the 2 bishops interact well. If you give away your rook, it's hard for the 2 bishops by themselves to generate lots of threats, even with the assistance of the queen. You keep your rook on the board, eventually you try to maybe maneuver it to attack stuff, you'll have much better chances to trick white, or at the very least create counterplay. So rook c5, it's not about the file. I just don't like it because you trade rooks still. Not to mention queen e7 is kind of an annoying move. So you play bishop f8, white plays queen e8, and now you're pinned up, the knight's coming to e4. I would say things are looking grim. You play bishop c6. White plays queen e1, which to me is a wholly mysterious move. Queen c8 you mentioned is a possible move. Obviously there's this discovery you have to be careful of, but I'm assuming that rook takes c5 just kind of ends that debate. So queen c8 is probably a really nice move. But even if you didn't want to calculate too much, even going back to e2s makes more sense than e1. Queen e1 is just very bizarre to me. But yeah, as you mentioned, queen c8 is probably a better move. So you play bishop d7. You're struggling to find a plan. The main reason you're struggling is because you have a lost position. When your position's bad, there's not that much you can do. You don't have that many plans. Oftentimes, you're just trying to glue your position together. But again, I'd say especially at the club level, if you just keep the position complex, if you avoid blundering, if you keep an eye on what your opponent wants to do, you'll have at least one chance to maybe get back in the game. I don't like your bishop d7 move, John, because you're taking your bishop off the potentially dangerous diagonal. Your bishop on d7 is never going to serve the same purpose as the bishop here. At least make white play f3, which maybe weakens this square for your bishop. Or play knight e4, which you can then kick with the bishop here. I don't know. I mean, I would think about moves like rook g5. Yes, the rook's really weird here. Spend a few minutes laughing at it. However, it at least makes white think. Maybe do I play knight e4, but then I have to watch out for rook e5 pinning my knight in some positions. Not here, I should point out. But say I even just come back here. Again, it's like the knight blocks the queen, the bishop blocks the rook. That's one move to consider. I just don't want to trade off the rook, is my main logic. But even if you do trade off the rook, at least play back here and keep the bishop on the good diagonal. Moves like queen b7 you can think about, immediately trying to provoke a pawn move. And again, the only reason you provoke f3 is to maybe one day in your dreams perhaps get a bishop here, which would at least provide you with counterplay. But again, you got to be looking for these types of moves. Knight e4, and here you play rook c6. Again, kind of tough to make recommendations, but I agree. Pinning the knight's better. Knight f6 check here does not work because of the queen can capture. And again, maybe you have some practical chances, but I like keeping the rooks on the board. That does not change. Once the rooks come off, you're going to have a hard time. Unfortunately, your queen and pawn are also attacked. I realize this pawn's defended, which I should have seen, but that's all right. It's been a long day. So, queen b6 would have been a better move. And again, this is just a very simple case of when you're down material, do not trade. Keep queens on the board, keep things interesting. The only exception is if you're about to get mated, you're allowed to trade queens. If you have pawns that can queen, trade the queens. When you're in a situation like this where there's an open file and if you trade queens, you're just going to end up in a lost ending, do not do it. Keep those queens on the board. Give yourself chances to save the game. After queen b6, you'd still have plenty of chances. After takes on c1, the chances of saving this position are minimal, mainly because you don't have dangerous pawns. It'd be one thing if you had like a weakness here to work with or could take this guy, but as I see it, you're just down the exchange. And here you collapse. And here's something else. I would say that when your position is bad, collapsing is really easy to do. Most games are not lost by someone outplaying their opponent indefinitely. They're lost by collapse. What I mean is that your position gets bad until you just can't defend it anymore, until you make an error. Human beings are not computers. Computers, you have to outplay them till the end of time. They're never going to blunder. Human beings, they get under pressure. What happens is you get a bad position, you get a worse position, and you just can't find moves that are good. And guess what? If you can't find a good move, you're going to find a bad one. And that's kind of what happened here, I think. So you were very critical of yourself for missing rook c7, and I have to be honest, rook c7 is the first move that comes to mind, regardless of where you put your bishop, because I want to penetrate with my rook. So missing this move is not a good thing. That being said, I totally understand blundering here, because your position is just not good. And again, when your position's bad, blundering is very easy to do. If you're asking me what I do, I don't have any great answers for you. Knight f6 check is the biggest threat, so I would try to deal with that. Maybe I'd play bishop e6. You mentioned bishop f5, which is also fine. But my hope, at least, let's say black plays rook here. I don't know if this is a good move or not, but just to give you an example, I might try b4 now. My goal is very simple. I just want to trade off some pawns. Or at the very least, maybe get a position where I can try to threaten you with this pawn someday. Maybe I'll try bishop b3 and eventually try to go after this. Again, I don't think it can really happen, but these are my hopes, these are my dreams, etc. Because if I can trade off some pawns, I might at least have some shot. If you can eliminate all these pawns, maybe you can draw the game against an opponent who doesn't know how to win. And guess what? At the club level, people are not technical endgame wizards. They will fail to win these positions a lot. But again, I would say that it's such a difficult position that not blundering here is an extremely tough task. Do I recommend, being more careful, looking at moves like rook c7, looking at moves like knight f6? Absolutely. But you can't be too critical of yourself for blundering these positions simply because it's so easy to do. Even very strong players, even top grandmasters in the world, if their position becomes bad enough, they will blunder. It's just a matter of when. And it's only the very top players who really are able to defend awful positions with perfection, or close to perfection as humanly possible, I should say. Karyakin is one amazing defender. But guess what? When he was in trouble against Magnus in that last game, when he had a bad position, he collapsed. Collapse happens to everyone, to absolutely everyone. A lot of the ways you try to win a chess game is you don't necessarily just outplay your opponent. You put enough pressure on them until they can't play a good move anymore. And that's kind of what does it. So after you blunder this, I don't think there's too much to go over. And now, resigning is a pretty safe thing to do in a position like this. Maybe if you're playing a complete beginner who barely knows how to move, you can continue to play on. But against most strong chess players, I would say this is not good. So again, I wouldn't be too harsh on yourself for this game, John. You made very understandable mistakes that most club players have made at one point or another, and even tournament players can do the same thing. But what I'd remember is, first of all, don't trust your opponent too much. They hang a knight in the opening, take it. Do not be so kind as you were in this game. The other thing is to remember pieces. Remember this bishop on a2. Make sure you're not opening up that piece for later in the game. Make sure you're keeping track of these moves. Also, as far as the giving up the exchange goes, if we can go back to that one moment, this was not a matter of a tactical thing. You missed knight g6. That can happen to anyone. But you panicked, or something went wrong in your calculations, and you didn't see that you could simply save your rook. And I'd say that this is one of those moments where slightly clear thinking after missing a couple moves can save you a lot of trouble in your games. Because you really had no reason to lose this game despite the fact your opponent was higher rated. In any case, I thank you for submitting your game. I hope that you learned some stuff from it, as well as perhaps a couple people in the audience. And I hope that you do better in your next game.